All right, parents, here we go again. It's the Ask Dr. Tony episode. This is the Experience Miracles podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Tony Ebel, an expert in pediatrics, neurodevelopmental disorders, and drug-free, nervous system-focused healthcare. On this weekly episode, I'll be addressing the top questions on every parent's mind. If there's one thing we love and welcome, it's parents who never stop learning, asking the hard questions, and advocating for your kiddos like none other. So get ready for some real talk, real-life clinical and parenting experience, and real easy to understand answers that will help your family take action and get to that next level of health and healing. You ask, I answer. Let's dive into today's episode. All right, everybody, for today's Q&A episode, we have, I don't know how to say this because it really shouldn't be, but I also fully understand how it is a controversial subject. We're going to talk about sensory processing disorder. We're going to talk about a study, which is linked in the show notes. Not a huge study, not the biggest group of kids, but a study that has quite an alarming finding that actually neurosensory motor-wise, I'm going to get all sciencey in this one per usual, makes sense to us. But it put a big number out there that 80% of kids born via C-section would end up or did end up with sensory processing disorder or sensory challenges. It goes by a lot of names: sensory integration, sensory modulation. And we'll talk about that here today. They also, in that study, found that preterm or early birth kiddos had an 84% connection to sensory. And I can sneak in some of the neuroscience behind that as well. Now, what I want you to know is when we posted this one up on Instagram, and so did a bunch of our individual PX Docs practices, it came with a lot of engagement. And that engagement split three ways. And when you read this title and you look at, because those are the numbers, that's what the study showed. And I will tell you, in our practice, if we look at the kiddos that we see for 17 years running with sensory challenges, so neurosensory, challenges, it's at least 80, 85, 90% of the time, that root cause, one of them, not the only one, and I'll talk about that here today, we can connect that back neurobiologically, neuromuscularly, if you will, we can connect that back to birth trauma and birth interventions like C-section, forceps, vacuum, breech, cord wrapped, induction, those sort of things. Obviously, with this conversation, we're going to focus big time on C-section. And the reason that is there is because it ends up triggering something called subluxation, neuromuscular dysfunction, and this whole sequence, this cascade of effects that leads to sensory motor dysfunction. So to really understand this conversation, we got to get into, well, what does a C-section do to motor development? We'll talk about gut and immune stuff too, because if you've heard some of the other side effects of a C-section delivery have to do with gut colonization, and the gut has to do with the immune system, and the gut is connected to the brain. So there's a little bit of that triggers the sensory challenges, but there's a whole lot of a different neurophysiological pathway that not many other providers know anything about. So if most other providers don't know about this really actually pretty easy to understand pathway that could come from C-section and connect to sensory challenges, if a lot of other providers and researchers don't know about it, don't talk about it, and haven't explained it to many other parents, of course, parents are going to be like, no way, that can't be true. So when we posted that up, there was three reactions. One, many families said, thank you for sharing this information. My mom got, our parent got, as soon as our child had this cesarean, because remember, a lot of them are, and this is kind of crazy to talk about, but it's just true. There's a spectrum and a range of sensory challenges. There's a spectrum and a range of autism severity. Well, guess what? There's a spectrum of birth intervention and C-section severity and injury. When it's scheduled, when everything goes fairly easily for the surgeon, for the incision, for getting hold of the baby. And remember, we're going to get into this next. They've got to get a hold of them by their head and neck, unless they're breech. And then sometimes it's a butt first delivery. But most of the time, the vast majority, they get in there, get a hold by hand of their head and neck. And then instead of mom delivering the baby, right, her nerves, her muscles, her pelvic floor muscles guiding, pushing, and putting the child through the birth canal and out into this world. In a surgical C-section delivery, that doc gets their hands on the baby's head and neck, uses that as leverage to yank, twist, pull, bring them into the world. I'm not using these terms to spark controversy. We're using these terms to spark your understanding of subluxation, sensory motor dysfunction, altered tone, coordination, and motor planning, long-term neurosensory neurodevelopmental connections. Again, I know it's a podcast, so I've got to do this with auditory only. I wish I had a whiteboard because I could literally draw this through a 3 to 4 step cycle. And if you could see the words, and you could even just watch a video of a C-section if you want to. I'll have my team put in the show notes a quick little YouTube video of a C-section, totally normal, routine C-section, not even a more emergency, get in there, get a hold of them, baby stuck, one nurse is on the table, pushing down, and while the doctors are yanking. But when we put that post up, a lot of parents actually thanked us for bringing awareness to something that has been swept under the rug for too long. Now, the second group was, that's intriguing. Please tell me more. I'd like to understand the neuroscience behind it. And that's where a lot of questions came into the platform from parents who thought for the first time, oh my goodness, that could be connected. And the first group was parents who already knew. They'd already found our content or just put it together themselves. Like, hey, my child had quite a tough birth and they were colicky from the beginning. Guess what colicky is? Hypersensitivity. They don't sleep well. They don't calm well. They don't soothe well. How is that different than a 5-year-old in kindergarten who can't stand the fluorescent lights, can't stand the tag on their shirt or the stitches in their sock or the textures of certain things they're doing as they play and go through class, or the certain noises that the noisy classroom, it's kindergarten, takes, right? Or the certain texture of certain foods. So sensory challenges in a 5-year-old, if you just simplify it, it's the same neurosensory challenges of a colicky baby or a toddler who's having tantrums and meltdowns, and people say, don't worry, they'll just grow out of it. So the first two camps of feedback we got when we put this on Instagram were those that kind of understood the whole time, I think there is something to worry about here. I think there is something to be able to look further in. I do think there's a connection, and some already knew it. And then a lot of you sent in a question and said, hey, could you do a podcast about this? Could you explain this further? Because a lot of research studies, when they're just looking at statistics like this one did, that's exactly what this study did. It was just a meta-analysis. They're just connecting dots. They didn't explain etiology or causation or neurophysiology or anything. They didn't even make an attempt at it, okay? That's going to be my job here. Before I do that, though, let's talk about the third camp that maybe still, as I keep talking on this one, if you're still listening, you're going, this might be the third camp. My child had C-section and we didn't have any sensory. We don't have any sensory issues. We don't have any neurological issues. I can't tell you how awesome that is, how much that is to be celebrated. And that's great. All of this, when we're putting out conversation, it's the hardest part of my job is to connect back to root cause. Every single time, and I've done literally probably, if I count up the ones I've taught to parents and the ones I've taught to other chiropractors, the 1,000+ times I have taught the perfect storm, when you go through and you connect the dots to the neurosensory dysfunction, subluxation, and the fact that birth interventions like C-section, like vacuum, like forceps, like induction, like epidural, that these things can and so often are. We see it in practice, we see it in the research, and the neuroscientific mechanisms are pretty black and white. When you connect back to those birth interventions, it's a very emotional conversation. As parents, when our kids are sick and struggling with anything from sensory to a fever, innately, naturally, we want to know why. That is our first absolute reflex. Why is this happening? What's causing this? That doesn't mean when we get the answer to that it's going to feel good. But what I want to be able to do, and I will do my best here, just like I do each time I teach that workshop, is to explain this. The only reason we are so obsessed with going back into your child's case history, going back into their birth story, their intervention, and figuring out if something like C-section could have been one of the triggers, which is why there is a third camp. It's one of the triggers of sensory challenges. It's not the only one. The perfect storm is a multitude. Autism is multifaceted causation, not one. So if you took Tylenol during pregnancy, it's not a guaranteed autism outcome. If you had a C-section, it's not a guaranteed sensory outcome. If your child has all the vaccinations, it's not a guaranteed autoimmune chronic illness outcome. What we know is that if there's Tylenol used in pregnancy, there's a higher risk of autism for certain individual families. What we know, and this study again proved it, is that if there's C-section, there's a higher risk on a percentage basis of sensory challenges. What we know is that if a child gets a full dosage of vaccinations and lots of antibiotics and corticosteroids, they're much more likely to end up with chronic illness and autoimmune. None of those cases, though, is an absolute. Not a single one of them is 100% of the time A will lead to B. That's not how neurophysiology works. That's not how we are genetically. That's not how health works. It is so complex. It is so multifaceted, and that's a good thing because what it proves is that children are resilient. They are adaptable. So some can have a C-section and not end up with sensory, but many, and we literally have to use this word because it's accurate. We see it in the research and we see it in practice. Most do. So let's get into that science, okay? If studies show that 80% of children born via C-section develop sensory processing disorder, your brain, whether this is your child or not, should go, why? And so what we see in our practice is that first injury to the brainstem and the neurospinal system. We're also going to talk about an area called the upper thoracics with this one. What a C-section does, if it's a real crisis, emergency, child's kind of breached and stuck and jammed in there or already started to go through different stages and then just got stuck and then we end up in emergency C-section from a deceleration. Well, those tend to be more physically traumatic to the baby's neck and brainstem and skull and spine and everything else because they're getting in there and they're getting them out of there. And awesomely, just like all of medicine, that is so often life-saving for mom and for baby. But the question needs to be asked and then answered, is it life-altering for the baby to be delivered that way? And is that alteration of neurophysiological function and sensory motor function going to increase their likelihood of sensory challenges, ADHD, autism? And the answer we know today is unequivocally yes, it is. Because births like C-section, interventions like C-sections, kick off a cascade of neurosensory motor dysfunction that isn't necessarily about how the baby is delivered. It's about how that delivery impacts the brain, the spine, the nerves, the muscles, and the sensory motor system for life until found and fixed, which will, as always, every episode, we don't just talk about the challenge. We don't just talk about the neuroscience behind the challenge and then leave you to it. We always round third base and say, okay, what can I do about this? How would I help this out? Okay. So C-sections, forceps, vacuum inductions put an excessive abnormal mechanical amount of stress on the infant's upper neck cranial system, and they also create a lot of distortion and what's called distension. So distortion would be twisting and distension would be kind of stretching, not only onto their neck and their spinal cord in that area, but throughout the whole spine and the neurospinal system. What we find with children born via C-section is they have a much greater incidence of subluxation, so somatic dysfunction, things not aligned appropriately, things not moving appropriately, things not functioning properly with the vertebrae and the cranial system. We find much higher incidence of subluxation and neurological dysfunction in the occiput, so that's the base of the skull, C1, that's atlas, C2, that's axis, so C1, C2 are the upper cervical, and we also find significant amounts of subluxation at what's called the cervico-thoracic or upper thoracic junction. All you need to know about that is that's your traps, that's your shoulder blades, that's the upper back. And these areas around the brainstem, throughout the neck and throughout the shoulders are absolutely essential because they house the key sensory motor reflex relay vestibular proprioceptive vagus nerve communication superhighway. So the sensory motor system and motor development starts with a baby needing to be able to do what? Latch and breastfeed. So they have to be able to move their neck and their jaw and their tongue, and they have to be able to use these nerves and muscles that are all coordinated from this occipital, C1, C2 area in order to be able to latch and breastfeed. Now I'm going to stay there. We're going to dive deep into each of these neuromechanical sensory motor elements, okay? This is the Experience Miracles podcast. We don't do surface level explanations. We go deep. So when a child has a cranial, occipital, upper cervical subluxation, their ability to latch, breastfeed, and nurse is significantly interfered with quite often. Some will be able to do it, but they're not very efficient at it. Some won't be able to do it much at all. And now this creates this massive stressful scenario between rockstar new mom, a beautiful new baby. Because breastfeeding is not only essential for nutrition, but breastfeeding is essential for sensory neuro co-regulation. Now that's a nerd term on top of and within a bunch of other nerd terms. But if you've ever seen, or moms, you rock stars that have done this with your beautiful babies, breastfeeding is not just nutritional. Breastfeeding is bonding and neurological. And a child can be hungry and wound up and uncomfortable. And when breastfeeding, it's a neurobiomechanical connection. So baby's nerves, baby's muscles, baby's jaw, baby's tongue, baby's throat, baby's cervical spine all need to be working perfectly. And then we actually need mom's nervous system to be as co-regulated as we can as well. Another conversation for another episode. We'll bring on our rockstar Dr. Ali for that and talk about the fourth trimester for moms and how much we care for them and we run HRV on them and we reset their nervous system and we regulate their nervous system and we're able to help them calm and connect and co-regulate from their end of things. But we're focused on baby with this one and connecting C-section to sensory challenges, because if a child isn't breastfed, well, then that's also a known increase for sensory challenges. Because not only do they often then get switched over to formula, which from a nutritional standpoint is going to bring in not as good of nutrients and then create more inflammation and gut dysbiosis and sort of challenges with the gut, which is then going to affect their ability to create and absorb serotonin and dopamine and calm their nervous system via the gut-brain connection, because the vagus nerve goes north from the top, south to the bottom into the gut. And the vagus nerve also goes from the gut, south, up, north. So you could literally, I could just have explained this connection between C-section, much more difficulty between latching, nursing, breastfeeding, and co-regulating, and sensory processing because of the nutritional component. But that's not actually the biggest deal. Neurosensory issues end up in the gut, but they don't start in the gut. Neurosensory healing can be improved with nutritional interventions, diet changes, getting rid of certain things, adding certain supplements, but its root isn't nutritional, it's neurobiomechanical. It's within subluxation. Now let's move with the same problem, this upper cervical subluxation, and let's move it to a different core component of development. Because when development gets altered, sensory challenges show up. If things don't go optimally, they go into the path of sensory and other sort of neurological developmental challenges. So the other thing that the upper cervical, the brainstem, and then the upper thoracic, so the torso need to do as well, is that controls the nerves, the muscles, the sensory motor input into the cerebellum and the brain, controls motor milestones. So what's a baby supposed to do after they learn how to breastfeed, latch, swallow, and digest their food? So they're supposed to learn how to eat, sleep, poop, and then move. The other thing babies are supposed to do is first, learn how to hold their head and neck up. Second, be able to handle and tolerate, not just tolerate, but love tummy time. Third, after head and neck control, which should be smooth and symmetrical. It shouldn't be stuck on one side. It shouldn't be difficult. Tummy time should be comfortable and easygoing. Then after tummy time, which is reliant on the nerves and muscles from the upper thoracic, so if they are injured or not activated from the C-section, they will struggle with all of motor development. Head and neck control, C-section babies are much more likely to have torticollis and plagiocephaly, and they're also more likely to struggle with breastfeeding and co-regulating, and they're also more likely to struggle with tummy time because their nerves and muscles via the C-section, so they had all the yanking and twisting onto their neck, that creates those muscles, leaves them stuck in what's called hypertonicity and tension, and then they did not get activation from mom's pelvic floor muscles for the thoracics to activate and kick on respiration and upper thoracic neuromotor, sensory motor afferentation into the brain. So they struggle with tummy time. Then if they can't do head and neck control and they can't do tummy time well, they struggle to roll over, and then they struggle to sit up, and then they struggle to crawl. And oftentimes C-section kiddos skip crawling, which is not good for the calming and integrating of the brain. So what happens with a lot of C-section kiddos is they're very subluxated in the upper cervical, they're very subluxated in the upper thoracic, and that sensory motor input is altered, and it leaves the brain receiving what are called, instead of calming proprioceptive signals, they get distorted, confusing, irritating proprioceptive signals, which is called nociception. At the heart of sensory processing disorder, you can actually break it down to this neurosensory formula. Kiddos with sensory challenges have decreased proprioception, especially from their upper cervical and their upper thoracic, so from the spine and the neurospinal system. So sensory processing disorder is decreased proprioception. Subluxation does that. It then opens what's called the gate, via the gate theory, for increased nociception. That's a nerd term for noxious, annoying, aggravating stimuli. So when you put on, if you don't have any sensory challenges, and you put on your shirt in the morning, and it could be a thick, cotton, heavy shirt, it could have huge stitches around the collar, and it could have a tag sticking out on the back. You could put on heavy Wrangler jeans and thick socks with aggressive stitches. Can you tell I'm a bit of a sensory kid? And then you could put on heavy, sweaty shoes. Sensory kids call shoes foot coffins, okay? And you could put those on. And the moment you put all these things onto your body, your tactile sensory motor system goes, hey, there's a heavy, thick shirt. Hey, this has a stitch. Hey, this has a tag. Hey, our socks have this. Hey, the jeans do this. Your sensory system initially takes in that information. That's called afferentation. But if your sensory system is not subluxated and not irritated, it then filters out that and says, not important. We don't need that information. It's not pertinent to our quality of life and the function we're about to do today. So you go about your business, and for the next many, many hours, your brain doesn't even notice, if you will, that you're wearing that shirt, that those stitches are there, that that tag is there, that the socks are there, that the jeans are there. Your brain tunes out that sensory information. It's still actually going in there, but the brain is so brilliant with its ability to process sensory information that it says, not important. We have other things in the hierarchy to focus on. But when a child is first having a subluxation and a neuromuscular sensory motor incoordination injury from C-section, that sensory, nociceptive, annoying stimuli that comes from those areas, their neck, their neurospinal system, and their sensory system, it's so loud and it's so constant and it's so much that they can't turn it off. Have you ever been in a room? Imagine right now you are trying to listen. Let's say your child has this challenge and you're listening very intently. You're listening very actively to all my nerdy words and all my intricate, detailed explanations, and somebody's making noise. Your kids are making noise in the back seat. Your husband's asking you questions. Hey, what are we having for dinner? And it's like, come on, man, or you're just at a noisy place. How much more difficult is it to really pick up what I'm putting down? Have you ever been driving down the road? This is a dad move right here. Dads, if you're listening, have you ever been driving down the road? And I know that you are a rock star dad and you're doing this right. You memorize every route. You could literally be thrown in the middle of a cornfield and know north, south, east, west. My kids like to joke that I must have swallowed a compass as a kid. and you refuse to use GPS. If this is you, fathers, I'm with you. I literally would like to be the president of the non-GPS fan crowd, okay? Grew up in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. I promise you, you could put me in the middle of a cornfield in Brazil. Give me 1 second, I'd be like north, south, east, west, okay? So while we're driving down the road, important job, because the driving job is important. Not the, hey kids, here's your snack, you got water, be nice to your sister. So the co-pilot job, piece of cake on a road trip, right? Driving, super serious. Just kidding. But we like to pretend it is so we can keep that job, because the job of handing out snacks and keeping the minions at bay, that's a difficult job over there in the passenger seat. And when the minions are making too much noise in the back, and maybe, just maybe, your memory of where to turn next is not so crisp and clear, what do you do first? You turn down the radio and you say, hey kids, be quiet. I can't think straight. Or you turn down the radio and go, turn that down. I can't hear where I'm going. Huh? Hear where you're going? Unless you need to, well, then you wouldn't be driving if you can't actually see. That's a real life example of sensory challenges. You're trying to focus on your visual system and get the most out of that, but your auditory system is being blasted by the radio and blasted by the kids. So in order to optimize your literal visual processing and where you are, your map, if you will, you would like it to be quiet. What about when you're doing work? Do you need it to be, if it's a bunch of noisy place? How many people are working in a coffee shop and they wear noise canceling headphones, right? All of us, to some degree, form, or fashion, have sensory processing challenges. All this study and this science is saying is that a C-section delivery is very likely, in the vast majority of kiddos, 80% or more, we actually see a higher connection even in our practice than the 80% number. So when I saw this study, it wasn't, whoa, that's crazy. It was, yeah, that makes sense. C-section triggers this dysregulated sensory motor input that triggers subluxation, sympathetic dominance, dysautonomia. The vagus nerve gets shut down. The brain is filled with noise. The brain is, it's basically like trying to live life and you're at a front row of a Metallica concert all day, every day with no headphones. That's why your child melts down at the slightest transition. That's why your child can't handle certain clothes, certain foods. That's why they struggle to fall asleep, because you got to get out of that sensory sympathetic storm to fall asleep. The perfect storm starts often with fertility and a stressful pregnancy, but the most common trigger of sensory motor dysfunction, and then down the road, sensory processing disorder and a bunch of other linked conditions, is birth intervention. The most common birth intervention, statistically, by a large margin, isn't forceps and it isn't vacuum. It's cesarean. It's C-section. So rounding third base, as we always promise to do, how do we help? Well, it's those neurotonal adjustments that calm that noise. What we've done is created and we utilize a multitude of chiropractic techniques, and we've really put together these neurosensory storm, calming, quieting care plan protocols and adjusting protocols. Because what happens for a lot of kiddos struggling with sensory issues, that upper cervical, that cranial, those upper thoracic areas, they're so subluxated and having so much sensory dysfunction and distortion that leads to that noxious sensory noisy input into their brainstem at all times. Our adjustments are exactly like taking the volume dial in my story before and quieting it and calming it down. We have certain adjusting protocols which are designed to take that stuck, raging bull, sensory overdrive, sensory overload, sympathetic nervous system and get it to calm down, get it to chill out. Those are very gentle, easy, calming, integrating, sensory reorganizing adjustments. And then other adjustments are designed, because what happens, and I won't go too much into this because I already got way nerdy with this one. What happens when your child has tons of tension in their neck and in their shoulders, and sensory kids are just full of it. That was your colicky baby, that's your tantrum toddler, that's your anxious grade schooler and teenager. You can just see their traps. You can see their neck full of tension. Well, then that leads to collapsed posture. It alters motor function, because this whole time we've been talking about the sensory and the motor system are connected. So often sensory kids have low tone and a weak core. They struggle to take a deep breath completely. They struggle to sit up easily. So they're wound up, full attention in their neck and shoulders, but they're worn out. And they have collapsed posture, and they have altered gross motor function. And so sensory kiddos can struggle with motor tone, posture, low tone, and all sorts of other issues as well. So those different adjustments may go into the core if your child has hypertonicity and some sensory issues that are hypersensitive, but most sensory kids also have some hyposensitivities. And we make adjustments to activate and stimulate the parts of the nervous system, the vagus nerve and the parasympathetic, which is suppressed and shut down. We need to activate those. So what makes our adjustments unique is some get into that sympathetic nervous system and tone it down and quiet it down so we can lessen the noise, the sensory noise going into the brain. And other adjustments get to that vagus nerve and that parasympathetic calming, processing, integrating system, and they activate that. What else does that? Movement. So it's not just chiropractic. If you're listening and you're literally living in a country, you know your child has sensory, and we don't even have a PX docs within 3 states, provinces, or a country from you, the number one thing that calms sensory processing challenges and helps a child heal from C-section is, yes, chiropractic, but 2, movement. So get them outside, get them swimming, get them climbing, get them into nature, get them grounding into nature, get them into things like martial arts and swimming that require a lot of cross-body integration and reorganization. Work on, you can even yourself, you can do big squeezes, heavy blankets, you can do just your own version. You can actually even go on YouTube and learn about different infant massages or different kind of sensory massages. You can get different chairs that kind of put a little bit of this proprioceptive input. You can get trampolines, you can get different things, anything that adds proprioception, that's movement, is calming and integrating into the brain. A neurotonal chiropractic adjustment is the most potent, specific, deeply rooted proprioception and mechanoreception we can ever get in, and it overrides subluxation, things like OT, PT, and natural movement. They're so helpful at calming and integrating the sensory system. Often they're not potent or punchy enough to override a stuck subluxation. But if you don't have access to chiropractic, or you're getting great results for your sensory kiddo with PX Docs and Neurotonal Chiropractic, but you're also thinking like, hey, we've been dealing with this sensory stuff for a long time. Some of it is still lingering. What else can we do? Biggest thing ever for sensory kids, get them outside, get them moving, get them doing climbing activities, get them doing cross-body, crossover, integrating activities, get them swimming, give them big hugs, be wrestling with them, playing with them. And then really that's the list of things that's good. The other things are really keep sugar, keep toxins out of their diet and your environment, keep them off screens. Screens are just going to take the sensory system and further overwhelm an already overwhelmed one. So when you're outside and you're moving and you're exercising and you're integrating and you're sweating and you're proprioceptive stimulating, guess what you're not doing? Sitting around plugged into a screen too. So all of those things are the benefits. I will finish this one now. I always think, it's a Q&A episode. I'll just knock this little guy out in 15 to 20 minutes. And then every single time, Dr. Morgan, Chris, and all of you, my podcast producers, and all of you guys are thinking, hey, maybe next year. He told the dad story about turn that down. I can't see where I'm going. That's a real life dad issue right there. Okay. Being a dad, road trip dad, tough gig. I don't know about that co-pilot job. Looks stressed over there. It looks tough, but until they fall asleep, then you're like, talk about sensory issues, just snoring over there. Just kidding. My wife has never fallen asleep and snored during a road trip. That is not recorded on the podcast. We're not putting it out there. Chris, keep it in there. All right, everybody. You need more information about sensory processing challenge. We have a ton of incredible articles on our website. I will have the team link them in the show notes. You can also just go to pxdocs.com, pxdocs.com, and type in the search bar, sensory processing, shout out to you Canadians, disorder, and you can learn a bunch about it reading on there as well. See you on the next one. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. Do you have a question that you would like to submit? Either send it to support@pxdocs.com with the subject Ask Dr. Tony, or head on over to our socials @pxdocs, where you can submit your question in our stories every single week. Every kid counts and every family counts, so let's leave no questions left unanswered. If you loved this episode and you want to help us reach more kids, we would so appreciate if you left a review and a rating on your favorite platform. God bless. Be well. We'll see you on the next one.